Hi, everybody. This is Nick Berbulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews that we're doing with authors of papers in the journal. Today's guest is Bryan Warnick. He wrote a paper that was the recipient of the Outstanding Paper Award, jointly sponsored between the Philosophy of Education Society and the journal Ed Theory. The original version of that paper was published in the PES journal. This version is a significantly revised and expanded version entitled Adaptation, Activism, and the Looming Climate Disaster. I have to tell you, I've developed a real fondness for this paper. It starts with a question I think many of us have thought about as parents or as educators, which is that our children, our students, are going to grow up in a world not of their making, in which it is quite likely that we've passed the tipping point of climate crisis. This paper was done before this record-setting summer, which was not encouraging, and that they may face a future of escalating global climate crises of various sorts that could be even potentially catastrophic. So it's a very serious paper. It's a very somber paper in tone. What does it mean to educate and raise children who will be prepared to deal with this prospect? Bryan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Nick. Yeah, this is probably one of the first articles I've written that was born out of fear, frankly. Over the past few years, I've watched as the climate crisis has escalated more quickly than I anticipated, and I think that most of us have anticipated. And the events of this summer, 2023, when we're recording this now, have only served to kind of reinforce that deep spirit of fear almost that I'm bringing to this question. We're seeing widespread wildfires, temperatures that are setting records, both air temperatures and sea temperatures. We're seeing floods, increased storm activity, and I don't know how you can look at this situation and not face it with a very somber sense of, what does the future hold for our students and for our children?
Sure. Yeah. So you review in your paper a range of different responses to this potential responses to this situation. One of which we all know, is that a significant portion of the population seems to be locked in a state of denial that this is a serious problem, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But why don't you say a little bit about what you see as some of the educational responses that we might engage in, the range of different options to help young people prepare for and cope with this future?
So I think there are a number of criteria that we have to look at when we think about what constitutes an adequate response. And I think, first of all, we can't impede a sense of kind of the activism that will be required to try to do something to stop or to mitigate the crisis as it proceeds. But also think we need to be, second, realistic that these solutions might not occur. So how are we going to help students to adapt to this world of environmental collapse, perhaps social collapse? And I think there are, as we talk about the adaptive responses, I think there are at least three that I talk about in the paper. One is survivalism. So if there is a world of social collapse, how will our children, how will our students survive? And we maybe going back to something more elemental, just basic survival skills. Maybe that's one thing that we need to teach. Another is kind of getting to the Stoic notion of apatheia, kind of giving students the emotional capacities to weather times of stress, times of trauma, helping them to gain an emotional distance to what's going on around them, a sense of perspective. And then the third response is enjoying and appreciating the moment. How can we help students to appreciate what is left and what remains after the climate crisis has had paid its toll on us as a civilization? those are three kind of possible responses to this mess that educators could seek to achieve. But I don't think any of them are really satisfactory. They all kind of fall apart as being adequate responses.
Say a little bit about why you think each of them are limited or inadequate.
Well, I think they all turn us inward in some sense. They turn us toward the individual, and the response that is required if we're going to try to mitigate climate change or to fight it in certain ways, especially through the political and policy process that will be absolutely essential. It's got to be a collective response. It's got to be a community response. We have to engage with others to try to imagine a different future. But all of these responses, survivalism, apatheia, living for the moment, all of these kind of turn the student inward. Giving them the emotional tools may be necessary to weather the storm, but not giving them the tools necessary to fight for climate mitigation in the future.
Yeah, and that sort of effort obviously requires a turning outward and engagement with others, and not just taking care of yourself or taking care for yourself. And here you broach into the other sort of option in the paper, activism. Say a little bit more about that approach, and again, how we educationally prepare students for that alternative.
Yeah, so any sort of response that tries to address climate change has got to be a activism with a really strong political edge to it. It just can't be changing your personal behavior, as important as that may be. It's got to be engaging with others in a political process to try to enact the policies and to fight the forces that are arrayed against change in policies. And that's a pretty tall order, and it's something that's I don't think we've ever seen before. Kind of the global collective effort that will be necessary to try to change the trajectory of human society. And what we might be doing if we follow that route is kind of setting up our students and ourselves for almost certain failure. I mean, it's such a colossal task that we set before us when we try to educate for political activism in this regard, that it will almost certainly end in failure, I think. The job is too great, it's too unprecedented. So my worry there is, are we setting our students up for failure and not giving them the tools they will need to survive in a very changed environment in the future?
Yeah, in the paper, I think you call it the unprecedented solution, the idea that, we've never before engaged in this kind of global cooperation, even when faced with a shared, and this certainly is a shared danger that is affecting the entire globe. But humans don't have a good track record of working together. And of course, there are other things, political rivalries, commercial interests, and other things that interfere with that sort of global cooperation.
And I see data that makes me even more pessimistic. The fact that as people rank their priorities politically, climate change has actually dropped as a political priority for people over the past few years. So that doesn't lend me a lot of optimism that we will be successful in mustering the political will to actually do something about climate change.
Yeah, so a couple of responses to that. One is, you talk about this in the paper, even if there's a significant prospect of failure, it may be that education for activism is the best available alternative, and better to try and fail, even in the face of an overwhelming or insurmountable challenge, than to give in or accept it, which all the first three options basically do. They all basically accept the inevitability, and by accepting the inevitability, hasten it. So it may be that activism, or a sort of realistic activism, I don't know what the quite word is. It's not exactly pessimistic, but it's
tragic activism is what I call it.
There you go. Is the best available alternative, in full awareness that the prospects for success are mixed at best.
Yeah, so this is where this version of the paper differs a little bit from the earlier version of the paper. So it does it strikes a more hopeful tone in some sense. Some of the responses, the adaptive responses, for example, certain forms of survivalism like homesteading, apatheia, the Stoic response, and even living for the moment. All of these have some seeds that we could, if we interpreted them properly, they have seeds that kind of could point us towards a certain sort of fruitful activism. For example, the Stoic notion of apatheia holds with it a certain sort of political engagement, where you have the courage to engage in the political process and speak truth to power because of the emotional perspective that you gain. So there are even something that seems as detached as apatheia might have some seeds for some sort of political activism. So that the divide between activism and adaptation might not be as big as we might worry moving forward. And also this notion of tragic activism, finding reasons to engage in fighting climate change, even though that fight might not prove to be ultimately successful. So I kind of developed, maybe there's some intrinsic reasons to engage in the political struggle, even when it might fail. Here, Camus is a big help. Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill, engaged in a fruitless task, yet finds meaning in it as well. In Camus' novel The Plague, he talks about a doctor that works that tries to help people even in the face of certain failures. And I think one of the most important reasons to engage in this tragic activism in the face of near certain failure, is its ability to kind of create a cross-generational relationship, or to preserve a cross-generational relationship. I think our children, our grandchildren will have every reason to resent our generation and the previous generations for failing to do anything substantive about climate change. And it's going to create this cross-generational divide. And that, those relationships, though, are going to be so important as we navigate the newly changed world. So how can we repair the relationship that will rupture? And I think tragic activism is a key to that. As we try to do what we can do, we can at least say to subsequent generations that we tried, that we did our best to fight in this struggle for climate change, climate justice. And I think that effort alone will do something to kind of repair or heal the relationship that is ruptured across time.
Well, as you know, I personally respond very strongly to this particular worldview as well. It does seem to me that educational theorizing generally, and the enterprise of education, is in some ways an inherently optimistic, forward-looking process of whatever stripe, critical pedagogy to No Child Left Behind to direct instruction, or whatever the different modalities are that are very, very different in substance or content. They're all based on the idea that if we just did A, B, and C, kids would learn more, kids would learn better, and society would improve. And there's something about the endeavor of education, and for that matter, philosophy and theory of education, that seems wrapped up in this idea that education is a means for improving the future. That's a notion that we don't really want to give up. But I think what your paper suggests is a bit of a corrective to that. What if that's just not true? What then? And I think it strikes me as very somber, obviously, very honest, and sort of unrelenting in its dealing with realistic questions that may be very disturbing in their implications. I really appreciate you for writing this paper.
Oh, it's been, I can't say it was a pleasure to write, but I think this really was not just my paper, but I've received such great feedback at the PES conference and through the review process that it's really sharpened and taken on a lot more substance than it did initially. So I think it's a testament to how the review process can work to improve one's thoughts.
Well, and how you responded constructively to that feedback.
Yeah.
Bryan, it's a pleasure talking with you. There's more in the paper, much more in the paper. I do urge people to read it. There's a link here with the video. Thank you for spending this time with us, and thank you for sharing your work and ideas.
Thanks, Nick. My pleasure.